Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. This is the Central Asia-Caucasus Institute Forum on the important new issue of the Blue Dot Network. It was announced on the 4th of November 2019, just a year ago, at the International Pacific Business Forum in Bangkok. It was initiated by 3 countries, the lead coming from Washington, the United States International Development Finance Corporation, the Japan Bank for International Commerce, and the Department of Foreign Affairs of Australia, the Troika at this point. And its purpose is to connect the key hubs of trade globally and to facilitate transit and trade between them. Very noble objectives. Many will immediately ask, is this some response to China's Belt and Road Initiative? Obviously, we will get into that, and we're fortunate to have as our speaker a key developer of this project and who's watching it very closely from the inside, Dr. Kaush Arha, who is at the United States Agency for International Development. He is a PhD in conservation and also a law degree, so he owes those to Berkeley and Stanford. He is also a veteran of a good chunk of time in Kabul, where he was involved with all sorts of issues of America's presence there, especially agriculture and on a national scale, and that meant communication and transport, of course, among other things. And then we're going to have brief comments from Dr. Svante Cornell, our esteemed director of the Central Asia-Caucasus Institute. He's in Sweden. And then Mamuka Tsereteli, Dr. Tsereteli, senior fellow of the Central Asia-Caucasus Institute. He is in Tbilisi, Georgia. So coming to you from Washington, New Orleans, Tbilisi, and southern Sweden, let us begin. Dr. Arha.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Starr. It's a pleasure to talk to you and to the group at your CACI Institute. So talking about Blue Dot Network, and as you mentioned, it was launched at the Indo-Pacific Business Forum by the 3 countries. And the issue is pretty straightforward, which is the following, that we have tremendous demand for infrastructure and connectivity, particularly in the emerging economies. So if you looked at Asian Development Bank, it would probably say about $1 trillion annual demand for infrastructure in Asia. Similar numbers are there for Africa from African Development Bank, or for South America from the Inter-American Development Bank. So somewhere in the range of almost $1 to $3 trillion of sort of demand. So there is a demand for infrastructure which is well recognized. It is also well recognized that no amount of just purely public money, even though they may be state-owned enterprises or state money, is going to be able to meet this demand. It will be a sort of the public agencies working as catalysts or drivers or facilitators for more private sector funds to come in this particular sector, and then meeting the infrastructure demand. That's a sort of a second given fact that we have on the ground. Concurrently, we also see that in at least the free market economies of the world, America being kind of one of the largest one there is tremendous amount of so-called supply investment funds, especially in the institutional investment issues, whether they be the pension funds or other large investment funds. There is a lot of capital there looking for investment. So in this particular context, it would make sense, especially for those countries and agencies committed to free societies and free markets, to provide sort of a solution which is a free society, free market solution of meeting the infrastructure demand and seeing how best we can play the catalyst role within that construct. So Blue Dot Network is an initiative that does 2 things. Primarily, it is focused at bringing private sector, more private sector private investment into the infrastructure sector. And when you say infrastructure, it is about being consistent with the quality infrastructure sort of investment widely agreed upon amongst the leading economies and countries of the world. So we had the G20 Osaka track, which laid out the broad principles of quality infrastructure investment. Blue Dot Network wants to operationalize those particular widely agreed and adhered to good infrastructure policies, not creating new standards or new sort of principles, but taking the existing one and operationalizing with the clear intention of getting more private sector investment in it. Now, in so doing, it is important that one of the important issues, especially in the emerging economies, to get the private sector money in there, is to sort of better brand and raise the profile of so-called good infrastructure. We say good, and sort of the quality infrastructure investment, first and foremost, is not to lose all the hard-earned lessons of infrastructure that we have learned in sort of the donor economies over last almost 40, 50 years, from the World Bank's times of big dams to looking at roads and railroad networks or ports or any of those issues that first and foremost talked about transparency in financing transparency, so it doesn't end up having a heavy burden on the economies, that actually makes an economic sense, and to the degree it needs to be subsidized, how and where and what. The entire life cycle of investment, so making sure that it's not just ribbon cutting and putting something in which may be shoddy, but that not only the construction but the operation and maintenance of that, so there's the full life cycle value of it, that the environmental and social standards that are there, which we have learned again from hard-learned lessons, that they are put in place both for sustainability, not only financial but environmental, the cultural sensitivities, all those issues that are there. Now, we don't have to reinvent the wheel, because this is widely agreed and procedures that are followed by US DFCs and our various agencies and the bank and the IFC investments and others. But what we need to do is to sort of highlight and brand this thing a little bit better than we've been able to do in it. And by so doing, getting more private sector investment, leverage that. So I think that's the short and sweet story of what Blue Dot Network is. I think it's important also to mention what the blue dot is referenced in this document, and I would sort of tip my hat to the DFC president, David Boigian. I think it came out of our DFC colleagues. It largely refers to when the Voyager is going there and looking back to the Earth, and in Carl Sagan's terms, referring to the Earth as a pale blue dot in a dark universe, the only home that we've ever known. So the idea of protecting the integrity of our home and Earth in as responsible manner as we can, while we are paving cement and doing the construction and improving connectivity. So that's where the name comes from. That is the purpose of this. This is a US interagency effort. So certainly DFC, State Department, AID, but all the other agencies are sort of within it. It was one of our driving sort of deliverables at the so-called G7, and it'll continue through that particular process as we move forward. And then we say, okay, you got to write this up, but sort of what have you done thus far in making this happen? And in this case, I think it's important to keep in mind that from both our main funding organization, like the DFC, which is the sort of the Build Act, when OPIC had about $29 billion as a cap, that was expanded to $60 billion. And so all those $60 billion now go into these quality infrastructure investments and leveraging the private sector. That's what backing the Blue Dot Network. With our Exim Bank now being, again, fully sort of functional, and the ability for them to have more than $100 billion able to leverage in supporting American companies, that gets to commit to that particular exercise. Whatever our Japanese colleagues are working on from their JPIC and their METI and other entities, they are supporting similarly quality infrastructure investment, which has the Blue Dot efforts on it. Our DFAT colleagues from Australia, the tremendous investment that they have in the Pacific Islands, which they're taking a strong lead on, in Papua New Guinea, and within new sort of submarine cables, among other issues, those are getting into being sort of recognizing and branding this particular exercise on Blue Dot Network. And we just had the 2+2 meeting between our US and the Indian counterparts in New Delhi just yesterday, and the ministerial statement would further sort of reflect that the strong support from the Indian government to Blue Dot and the synergy between the India-led Coalition for Disaster Resistance or Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, CDRI, and Blue Dot Network as India and Japan and Australia, the so-called Quad, work on the east-west connection and corridor from India out east to Vietnam. Those will again would be sort of the representatives as the Blue Dot Network initiative is further developed. So I'll stop there. And one other thing, we just had a important event thanks to our Estonian colleagues, and thanks for Estonia for sort of showing tremendous leadership and hosting the 3 Cs initiative that just happened last week in Tallinn on Monday, with the 3 Cs being the Baltic, the Black, and the Adriatic Sea. That is, and in that initiative, again, the leader statement sort of welcomed and supported the Blue Dot Network. So I think the idea would be that as this particular network does, it's both the branding and a sort of a certification system, the details of which will take some time to work out, but that's the objective, that's the initiative. I'll stop right there and take any questions and welcome the comments that our colleagues would have.
Thank you very much. Before turning to our expert commentators, very quickly, what does this mean for Central Asia, the Caucasus, Afghanistan, Mongolia?
Well, I think thank you for that question. As I think few people know better than you in your writing, that we are at the, if you're talking about connectivity and transcontinental connectivity, then the center of that, pretty much the heart of it, the fulcrum of it in many ways, lies in the Caucasus and the Central Asia. So I think if we are talking specifically, looking at Georgia and the upcoming and the redoing of the port within Georgia, very much as it would receive funding from our side and from EIB, I mean EBRD, or from EIB, they would be consistent with the Blue Dot Network issues, and we'd like to highlight that. As we are talking about the railway connection that everybody is so proud, and I think rightly so, between Georgia and Azerbaijan and neighboring countries, that would another would be an important link, as it would be for the Alyat port on the Azerbaijan side, which connects across the Caspian onto the issue. And then certainly for Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan as being the heart and linking up all of the various initiative of good infrastructure that we have talked about historically at the various initiative, whether it be the NDN network or it be the lapis lazuli, any of those elements, to the degree that they would have European and American investment, by definition meeting the high standards of this, and by so doing attracting more of private sector. And I think we've had some of these issues with the Caspian Policy Center and got a pretty strong and I think an enthusiastic support from the deputy ministers of a lot of the Central Asian countries, including Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, and certainly Kabul. So I think a very strong potential, and my friend Javier Piedra, if he's on, and so I think his sort of key project of CARIM, the Central Asian Regional Energy Markets or Electricity Market Initiative of resuscitating the old sort of electric grid that connects Central Asia, that is another classic, I think, World Bank and US and other partner initiative that would fit in as as a Blue Dot Network qualified project. So tremendous amount of thing on existing one with more sort of DFC and XM and other colleagues doing it, but then also elevating and realizing the tremendous sort of potential of the Caspian and the Black Sea countries working as hubs or roundabouts for transcontinental trade, commerce, and connectivity. Over.
Good. Thank you very much. Let's now turn to Dr. Cornell from Sweden.
Thank you very much, and I'm very glad to hear Dr. Arha speak about this. Dr. Arha, of course, has been a close friend of our institute and its many activities for many years, and we're very glad to have you on. I'll just be very brief in my comments, and they'll be mainly based on a study that I published last year together with my colleague, Swedish colleague Nicholas Swanström, about the European aspect and the European perspective on China's BRI initiative. And I would say that some of the conclusions we derive from that study are also applicable for the United States. The first thing I'd like to say is that over the past 30 years or so, I think there has been a lot of complementarity between the Chinese and the US interests and activities in Central Asia and the Caucasus. There are differences which I'll get to in a moment. But I think one of the main conclusions I think you can draw is that comparing Central Asia and the Caucasus in the 1990s, in the early 1990s, when it was basically in transport-wise connected solely northward to Russia, the Western powers, and then I'm really talking about the US, EU, and Turkey, at least in the 1990s. Turkey may have different views today about where it belongs. Did the important task of opening up the Caucasus and Central Asia from the West. And in many ways, China was doing the same thing from the East. And in that regard, the broader objectives in the region and the global situation might be a different one. I think the Western and the Chinese interests are to some degree compatible, which is to build trade, to develop a land corridor connecting Europe and Asia. That has important implications because it means that both China and the Western powers, in principle, have a common interest in the stability and the continued existence of functioning states in Central Asia and the Caucasus, which also, and our institute has showcased this in at many occasions, that there is, in principle, a Chinese, or has been a Chinese support for sovereignty and independence of the states of Central Asia and the Caucasus. And in this limited sense, there is a closer compatibility, if you will, between the Chinese position and the Western one than there is with Russia. Obviously, there are differences, and I think in many ways this is where the compatibility ends. And if you look at the way China has operated its activities and its investments in infrastructure, it is clear that the structure, the methods, the financing, the opaque nature of deals, the onerous conditions that are imposed, when we even know what those conditions are, which is not always the case, has been very problematic for many countries, not only in Central Asia, but particularly in other states. And this, I would say, supports rather than combats or undergirds rather than undermines the problems that many of these countries are facing in trying to reform their economies, particularly, of course, the issue of corruption, which we know that countries from Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan in particular are now trying to work on and to make states more efficient and effective. The way China is operating is not something that makes them, if you will, allies in the efforts to combat corruption in the infrastructure sector. In fact, it would facilitate and maintain the existence of corruption. There is another major difference, I would argue, which is that the Chinese have obviously, through their Belt and Road Initiative, focused entirely on transport corridors and infrastructure that supports the East-West axis of trade, not the one that goes north-south. In other words, the Chinese are not interested in supporting anything that connects Central Asia with South Asia, which obviously throughout history has been a much closer trading partner for Central Asia than it has been with East Asia. And that means that if there is an infrastructure development in Central Asia that focuses entirely on the Chinese priorities, because that's the only place from which Chinese funding would be coming, that would result in a very warped infrastructural situation with, yes, important connections going east and perhaps west, but nothing that really connects Central Asia to South Asia, which also means that it will not be effective in supporting the development of a peaceful Afghanistan. This also means, I would argue, that there's a big difference between the interests of Central Asian countries and of China, because the opening up of a corridor to the south, connection through Afghanistan, with Afghanistan and through Afghanistan southward, has always been one of the major objectives of Central Asian states. When we hear Uzbeks talking about through where to export their cotton, we don't hear them talking about Shanghai, we hear them talking about Karachi, Gwadar, and the ports of the Indian Ocean. And I think this has been the case for a very long time. So I think against this background, it is clear that there are some important compatibilities and similarities between the Western approaches and the Chinese interests, but also very important to see the difference. And I think what Dr. Arha has spoken about here in the Blue Dot Network comes in exactly here. I know that a lot of people who react to it will compare, the amount of billions of dollars and say that, well, how can you balance China's Belt and Road Initiative? I would submit that is the wrong question to ask for several reasons. First, because the very existence of a network that promotes a more sustainable form of investment and a form of sustainable development of infrastructure, by its very existence, will be appealing to the forces in government all across the region and elsewhere in the world that are interested in the long term, that are interested in, so to speak, building a sustainable form of government in their own countries and not taking on onerous debt to China that will come with a very big political and economic consequences in the future. Therefore, even though these projects may not be at the scale of the Chinese initiatives, I think they have a very important role to play just by their existence. And also, I think this is particularly important because in their absence, it would be very difficult for the reformist forces in Central Asian countries to carry the day. They have to be able to point at, well, what's the alternative? If there are things that Central Asian states see to be in their interest, both in the way they are financed and also in the nature of these projects and the type of infrastructure they are and to where they connect, there has to be an alternative or a complement to what the Chinese are offering. I would say that so far we also have seen that all in all, the Central Asian states have been very careful. If you look at, although that is true particularly for the larger states like Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, smaller states like Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan are very much in danger of being trapped in the debt situation that countries from Montenegro to Sri Lanka and others have put themselves in, Maldives among others. But as far as the larger states are concerned, if you look at a BRI map of the world, you will see a lot of projects that have a BRI stamp on them. In fact, when you look very closely at them, you find that the Chinese role in these are relatively limited. The Papan-Gren Railway, for example, in Uzbekistan, yes, China contributed, but it was mainly an Uzbek government funding and significantly World Bank investment. If you look at the Baku-Tbilisi-Kars Railway, there is, as far as I'm aware, no Chinese involvement in how that came to be, but you find it on the BRI maps, which is, there's nothing wrong with that. It's just an important reminder that there is a lot going on in these countries that's been funded by Western partners, but most importantly by the countries themselves, and they have been very conservative in the extent to which they have opened themselves up to the type of Chinese role that other countries have. Again, with the significant exceptions of the smaller countries, poorer countries. The big question is one of commitment. We have obviously a week in election. We also have a pandemic, a transatlantic coalition that is working the way it should be. It is obvious to me that the discussion in compatibility with the EU new strategy for Central Asia, obviously the ability to carry this forward in the future, I think, will depend on several things. One is the future commitment of the US government to continue to work on coordination between Japan, India, Europe, and other like-minded partners, and obviously in the ability of the Europeans and Americans to also have some form of coordination and discussion on Central Asian matters. But I'll leave it there and hand the floor back to you, Dr. Starr.
Thank you very much. Let us turn now to Dr. Baratelli from Tbilisi.
Thank you, Fred. Dr. Arha, first of all, compliments to you and your efforts to not only work hard on this initiative, but also to communicate progress to different audiences. I've had the chance to attend a couple of your presentations in different groups, and I think it's very important that you keep working hard to maintain branding of this initiative and communicating essence of it to different audiences. I would like to just say a few words, not to take much of the time. Since the 90s, there were several different U.S. government policy initiatives. We remember in relations to Black Sea Caspian region. There was a multiple pipeline policy and strategy that actually materialized in building multiple pipelines connecting region to the markets in westward. There was a so-called Silk Road initiative that Fred remembers well and contributed a lot in branding and understanding that initiative. There was a later, during and after the war, during the later stages of the war in Afghanistan, Northern Distribution Network, as you recall, Kaush. There are now several different initiatives, like you mentioned, Three Seas initiative in Europe that the United States government is supporting. There is an energy, so-called PTEC, right? Partnership for Transatlantic Energy Cooperation, also initiative of the US government that enhances energy security for European countries and allies. So I would like to just here, maybe I'll be one first person to ask you a question, if I may. All these different initiatives in the past and in today that relate to our region, relate to Black Sea Caspian region. Do you see this Blue Dot Network as a kind of umbrella initiative that will integrate all these different past and present and future initiatives under one? And because I think you understand the importance of these perceptions of broader audiences. I think sometimes we are lost in different initiatives, different terms, and having it under some kind of umbrella would help us to clearly see objectives as well as realities and different elements and components that contribute to this achieving the major goals of these larger initiatives. So how can you comment on that, if I may ask you this?
Thank you very much. Dr. Arha.
Yes, thank you very much. And again, thanks for the opportunity, Mamulka. But you raise a very good point. And I live through this every day. I think that one of the great beauties of living in a sort of a democratic society and having freedom of expression and speech is that it applies to a broad interagency government with everybody's favorite sort of projects. And then people like myself, as you rightly pointed out, is trying to make sense of it and see how they are connected or related. And in many cases, the other interesting thing is that, particularly for a country like America, when we cannot even answer a straightforward question as to how much does the United States contribute to a given sector, whether it be health or humanitarian or agriculture or infrastructure, just because, and the reason is we have so many multitudes of efforts underway, let alone in the government, in this sort of government phenomena. And then there's the entire private sector. Then there's an entire sort of private and personal donations, sort of civil society, and then the substantial academia as well. So put them all together, we actually, in many ways, our strength of our diversity and multitudes of efforts also becomes on occasions in the branding situation a bit of a handicap, to put it, as you said, in one way. And our partners are always rightfully most forgiving, most patient, most indulgent in sort of every other new American coming in with a new initiative and sort of supporting it at the same time, as you said, keeping their confusion to themselves and politeness to say, okay, how do all these things fit together? So I think a great question, and this is something which will always need good, important watching as we go forward. The other important thing is, of course, elections happen, new folks come in, they want their own initiatives, it's around we go. But with how does Blue Dot fit into that particular perspective? So some of the initiatives that you mentioned are sector specific, like the one you referred to, energy. Some of them are regional initiative, like you referred to either 3Cs or the Northern Network, Northern Distribution Network, or to the degree that you talked about the Silk Road and the old and new and the various iterations of the Silk Road. Those are fine, I mean, CAREC and others. Blue Dot, let me just step back a little bit. I think what you will find furthermore, as Swante mentioned, Europe has its Europe, Asia, and now Global Connectivity Initiative. And from our side in United States, we have sort of our Indo-Pacific, from African coast, from Kilimanjaro to California, from sort of Mongolia to New Zealand, a big sort of region to do it. And then other Prosper Africa and other regional initiative in Latin America, America Crece. For all of those, you'll find three lines of effort, both on the Europeans and on the American non-sectoral side, which you'll completely and more sort of reaffirm. Energy, digital, and infrastructure. So you'll see those again and again. So that'll be one important theme. Blue Dot Network relates to the infrastructure transportation element of that, but is not limited to a sector. So pretty much all, in a way, it is the umbrella that you talked about. And it is important that if there is the train that was referred to earlier, if there is a port, which may be a typical, if there is a new electric grid that was talked about in Karam, if there was a digital cable that went across the Pacific or the Caspian Sea, all of these are sort of infrastructure projects which will be Blue Dot. And it is important, again, going to Swante's point, which is very critical, that it is confusing in people's mind. It has become somewhat confusing on infrastructure, whether it's a quality infrastructure or less so, because on the broad branding of sort of BRI, I mean, a lot of the money that you get from EU in the DG near area, whether it be a bridge or a railroad, whether it be bridge in Croatia or a railroad in Caucasus, comes under BRI, which is largely EU funded. And you can get confused whether this is a C+16 or 17 initiative, or is it largely overwhelmingly in EU funding. So it is important to sort of clearly recognize and brand infrastructure that are adhering to widely agreed quality infrastructure investment. Those are the Blue Dot. From those that are not doing so. So that at least there's a clarity of where it is, and it'd be perfectly fine to have different sort of investment threads in it, as long as people are sort of transparently aware of where the money is coming from, what are the deals, what is the financial implications, what are the environmental social issues, and what are the life cycle cost of operation and maintenance, so that if we did all this, an infrastructure project should strengthen a nation's sovereignty, not diminish it. That it really works for all of the citizens of that particular country, as we have benefited in the United States and Europe, and then that be the case. So I think that is what it is, and I appreciate you raising that question. Furthermore, I think it's important to say, since you talked about the various initiatives that we have and how they fit into one or the other, it is really important to see that how different countries looked at the infrastructure issue and then what solutions we came up with. And it goes back to, since you mentioned 90s, a little bit before that. So when we had the big debt crisis back in 80s, and you had, you know, Pope John Paul and Willie Nelson and all these guys doing different concerts and asking the Western world to sort of forgive the overwhelming debt on the HIPC countries, the highly indebted poor countries at that time. And hence came Paris Club, And hence came this whole initiative that we need to have transparency in financing. United, not only by playing the strong role in United States back then and sort of coming up with Paris Club and being one of the members of it and providing the debt relief. After that, in President George W. Bush's administration, we did a thorough analysis of the demand and why this happened in African countries. And we found that a lot of the African countries at that time had important infrastructure needs, but did not have a strong enough economic base to truly take huge amount of loans and build it, and then got caught into this debt trap. But the need was there, the financial basis was not there. So what was the right way to address that? In that, United States came up with the Millennium Challenge Corporation, which was specifically the idea that we're not going to give loans to poor country for infrastructure, that we will give them grants for good infrastructure. In response, we're not going to ask for a port or anything of their national assets. All we're going to ask in return is good governance. So the MCC Compact says, hey, here are 13 or 14 or 17 considerations, of which financial transparency was the kind of predominant one and across the board. And if you met those, then we'll sit down and look at what the important infrastructure needs are and how can we fund it. So that was our response to this. And in many ways, that is what still lives through in what the Blue Dot Network would be of all other infrastructure projects that will come from that lane. That is a very different approach than our friends in Argentina have taken, that, you know, either I'll build a port and then I'll take a 99-year lease, or we'll do this and, you know, take another sort of elements of it. So oftentimes the foreign assistance or development assistance of a country are the very clear and direct sort of external representation of that country's values or interest. And so we do what we preach at home and talk about these things. That's what we did back in MCC. That's how we have done with our in OPEC going to DFC on our Exim Bank issues. That is how we have worked with our Caucasus colleagues, Georgia and Azerbaijan, and certainly our Central Asian colleagues in working on these issues. And we would hope that Blue Dot Network sort of provides the umbrella good brand of infrastructure and development, and by so doing getting more private sector money in it. But having said that, this is still a initiative with great promise that needs, I think, a lot of, as you said, good strong tending with next administration to reach all its potential. Over to you, Fred.
Now I have to interrupt here with a very fundamental question for Caucasus and Central Asia, and especially Afghanistan. Will India join?
Yes.
And the implications?
Well, again, I mean, I just think I won't speak. I mean, I want to give you a short answer because I want to beat about the bush on with India join. It's really up to Indians, not to me. But I think it's in very clear and direct interest of India. And the fact that when India initiated its, CDRI, the Coalition for Disaster, America was one of the first not only to join it, but also USAID, kindly facilitated the funds for the secretariats of the CDRI, and we are full supportive of it. And as it was mentioned in the joint statement between President Trump and Prime Minister Modi earlier this year, and the 2+2, India certainly has indicated strong support for this, and it is in India's strong interest to be a key partner in this particular exercise. So without speaking for our Indian colleagues, I think the strategic directions are very clear. So now what are the implications of it? The implications to a large degree are, as you have talked about several times, India sits at the crossroads of the great transcontinental trade and commerce historically, and I think the future of it. It's a fulcrum that links the Indochina, the sort of Indo-Pacific rather, from Vietnam and the Mekong countries to South Asia, to India, and then certainly from India to the Caucasus, connection. And not only that, but also from India directly north, as Swante mentioned, to Uzbekistan, to Samarkand, then to Almaty and those. So I think these three vectors of which India has a sort of strong and growing ambitions under Prime Minister for India's sort of regional aspirations is certainly with Africa. So as India and then Indo-Pacific, both for India and for us, is the Eastern Board of Africa as well. So you've seen a very key role radiating in all four directions from India, and infrastructure would be this.
Well, this is going to be a crucial issue. You have to run. I understand you have a meeting across town. Let me ask this, if I catch one more question before your departure. These various initiatives that have been undertaken by all the major powers, including the United States and Europe, they're all excellent, and the term branding has come up here several times, as has the word umbrella. But fine, you know, you're branding something and pulling things under an umbrella. The question I want to ask is much more, it's a different function. It's not just a passive statement, and that is, what about the switchboard function? The problem is, you have given us a switchboard. You have indicated that this could be a central place globally for information and activity in this zone. But it won't be unless there is a designated and internationally recognized office or institution where this is all centered. Is there going to be?
Yes, I think so. The second part of the Blue Dot has both a branding and a sort of a certification part to this. And so the certification is something that'll probably take 1 to 3 years, and some long time to figure it out, doing it just right, so that you are certifying good quality infrastructure without it becoming a burdensome, a sort of a cost on private sector to actually entry into the system. The whole idea is to facilitate, so that nuance will have to be done. To that particular degree, certainly institutions like OECD and others would have a valuable role to play in sort of facilitating the eventual secretariat of the Blue Dot network, which will play the role that you just articulated, the switchboard. There may be very much an interim entity such as OECD or others who can play that role because of their good work and infrastructure or trust and business, all of those sort of key initiatives. But eventually, it needs to be a sort of self-sustaining body of a secretariat that is found useful for the private sector, so that they would be willing to sort of contribute to its sustenance, including the sort of the developing and the contributing countries, which does exactly the role that you're playing of the switchboard. So I think that is the anticipation, and as Swante and others mentioned, I think that is for the next administration to take it on and get it to the sort of fruition, whichever administration it is. But yes, that is the anticipation, that is what it should be. And as a result, also have so when that happens, it'll also, and a private sector advisory board. So this entire process is then directed with, from the ground up, close interconnectedness with the private sector to say, what would help you to make sure more investment comes into quality infrastructure, and what would be burdensome, and how can we best resolve it?
Thank you very much. I want to thank Dr. Arha and send him on his way. And I'd like to address the next question to Mamuka Tsereteli and Tbilisi. If you were to word check Dr. Arha's presentation, you might be surprised at the number of mentions of the Caucasus. Now, maybe that was because he would like to make a trip to Georgia, who wouldn't? But maybe it's because the Caucasus are emerging with a greater degree of importance on these transport issues than was the case just a few years ago. What is the state of opening the Caucasus in terms of roads, railroads, pipelines, and ports?
Few things. Before answering directly your question, maybe I'll tell you why I think this central role of Caucasus is re-emphasized maybe by Kaush, but also by others. He mentioned this 3C initiative. This is Central Eastern European initiative of 12 EU member countries. And this is all about interconnectivity, but interconnectivity and connectivity of very interesting parts of Central and Eastern Europe. It talks about connectivity between Gdansk and Constanza, between Poland and Croatia and Adriatics. So it's a 3Cs, it's Baltic, Adriatic, and Black Sea, where Black Sea is obviously seen as a part of this initiative, but not fully integrated into it because it's countries of the Ukraine, Georgia, Azerbaijan, and others are not members of the European Union. But having significant investments coming into that direction in the future, I think naturally raises interest to see how Caucasus, South Caucasus countries and Central Asia could be part of that process there, since there is so much policy makers' interest from European Union, but also from United States. United States actually committed $1 billion of development finance corporation money to that initiative. So I think, and that's on the western side of the Caucasus. On the eastern side of the Caucasus, we see tremendous development in Uzbekistan in terms of reforms and attracting attention of investors, despite the COVID and despite other obstacles that are all around these last several months. Still, Uzbekistan is the center of attention of many from investment community as well as donor institutions. And it's interesting that, as you probably recall from the President Mirziyoyev's speech at the UN, he mentioned that Uzbekistan's trade with its neighbors increased in fivefold in just 4 years. Of course, it was low trade rate with neighbors, but fact is that there's a different dynamics emerging in Central Asia. I also looked at some data recently of transshipments of some of the types of cargoes from Central Asia to Black Sea via Azerbaijan and Georgia ports and railway. And I see even in 2020, we see growth of shipment of fertilizers, some of the chemical products, metals, and other raw materials, but also some of the shipments coming from Europe, like Romanian ports or Ukrainian ports going into Central Asia. So we see greater dynamics of trade and transit through Caucasus because of the economic activities in Central Asia. That interest is, what I'm trying to say, is driven by growth of interest on both sides of the Caspian, or Black Sea side as well as Caspian side. Now, to answer your question, there are lots of activities happening. We know governments are investing money as well as private sector is investing money. I think we still need to do some of the investments, not we, I mean everybody, countries themselves, as well as donor community, in soft infrastructure development. While there is a growth in hard infrastructure, ports and other elements of facilities that are developing, but still at the same time there are some bottlenecks in the system, of whether it's border crossing, whether it's kind of customs or some other elements of that. Obviously, again, COVID makes movement of goods is a little slower than before, but that also hopefully will be addressed early next year. So now, if you ask, if your question referred to construction of the larger port facility on the Black Sea, I think there is a necessity of that infrastructure element to be in place, but it's more, I would say, based on what data that I have and data I looked at, it's probably needs to be in place between 5 and 10 years from now. but it's absolute necessity to increase shipments of those larger amounts of cargoes that are coming from Central Asia going to Europe and vice versa.
That refers to the Anacleo port.
Yes.
Well, there seems to be an activation of international engagement on transport again, and relevant infrastructure. I wonder, Svante Cornell, if you could comment on how you see the external internal balance of are the countries involved in Central Asia and the Caucasus themselves organized to interact in the ways that Dr. Arha has set forth?
I would say that they are not, and they are not primarily because the way they are organized is mainly by informal contacts. Now, the good news is that over the past 5 years, I would say, there has been a remarkable improvement in the quality and the quantity of informal contacts between leaders, both within Central Asia and between Central Asia and the Caucasus across the Caspian. We have seen visits, for example, between Azerbaijan and Georgia with Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and other Central Asian states. Turkmen-Azerbaijani relations have improved, among other, and obviously we now have both yearly meetings of Central Asian presidents and concrete efforts at cooperation. What is missing is any form of structure that makes this institutionalized. We see this particularly, I mean, this is already a region that is top-down, where very frequently you have to wait for the top person to make a decision, and that resolves problems. But down the road, if this is going to happen, we are going to need to have mechanisms of cooperation that don't have to wait for the president in each country to make a decision. There has to be abilities of people at lower levels, be it at the ministerial level or ideally at lower levels of government, to take the day-to-day decisions that are required for all of this to function in real life. And that will not be possible unless there is a ASEAN or Nordic Council style cooperative venture being created.
It's a very striking issue that here we are talking about billions of dollars. Obviously, the Chinese have already been spending large sums in transport and infrastructure, but now a coordination and revitalization of other efforts, especially through the Blue Dot Network, which is involving very significant powers. And after all, Japan, Australia, and we hope soon India and the United States. Well, this is all very good, but they all have to deal with each country totally separately, and each country ends up on a different track, and the structures for cooperation within the region are now potentially a serious impediment to development. So here we are, in a sense, well-wishers from the outside, looking for region-wide entities with which to interact, not as an alternative to sovereign states, but as a region-wide supplement and enhancement. They're looking, but they're not finding it, and that's the reality. Any further observations from either of our two?
Yes, let me just quickly add to that point. I think that the real question facing the region is to what degree or at what cost you focus on cooperation that involves every member of the region. What we're seeing everywhere in the region, very clearly in Central Asia, I mean, the Caucasus is different because we have two countries literally at war with each other right now. But in Central Asia, we have a situation where there are countries that are positive towards intensifying and deepening cooperation. Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, I think to some degree Kyrgyzstan. Whereas there are countries that are more cautious and do not want to proceed at broadening and deepening cooperation as quickly. Turkmenistan, Tajikistan. Afghanistan, I think, is more positive than they are actually to institutionalizing cooperation at this point. So far, we have seen an emphasis by the driving forces in Tashkent and Nur-Sultan that they want everybody to be on board. The problem is very much similar to the one the EU faced 20, 30 years ago, when the EU had certain countries that wanted to intensify cooperation very rapidly, and those that thought, well, you know what, we're kind of fine the way we are. So that led in the European context to a two-tiered, at least tiered system, whereby some countries moved quicker in terms of cooperation than others. At some point, the question is whether Central Asia has to similarly, the leading countries that are interested in developing structure might have to go ahead and keeping a door open and tipping the hat in some way to the countries that are not quite ready to move ahead.
Well, it's fascinating to see how this very commendable initiative, the Blue Dot Network, is inevitably bringing to the fore issues within the regions that we're discussing, Central Asia and the Caucasus, that have long, I suppose, pulling back, we can say that the great contribution is that this might indeed contribute to a greater willingness and readiness to bite the bullet and engage in intra-regional institution building to make their interactions with the outer world and the world economy more effective and more efficient. The price of not doing so grows daily, and I think that's one of the major conclusions doing the Blue Dot from the perspective of Central Asia and the Caucasus is one of the major conclusions that should be reached. So with this, our hour is up. I want to thank Dr. Kaush Arha once again for not only for joining us this morning, but for the very active and central contribution he's made to the Blue Dot Network. I want to thank Dr. Svante Cornell, our director, and also Dr. Mamuka Tsereteli, who is a senior fellow and very, very active participant in the life of the Central Asia Caucasus Institute. And thank all of you who tuned in.
Thank you.